Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Antoni Cimolino. I'm the Artistic Director of the Stratford Festival of Canada, and I'm here also as the Director of Macbeth, which is part of our Stratford Festival on Film series. And we will be playing this film for free from May 7th to May 28th. And today we have a special treat for you. We have an internationally renowned Shakespeare scholar, a historian, Stephen Greenblatt with us. And Stephen teaches at Harvard. He's written a series of brilliant books that are such a pleasure to read. Will in the World, The Swerve, which we'll be talking about next week when we discuss The Tempest. Also recently, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve. But today we want to really delve into a book that he wrote called Tyrant. And I'm going to plug it because it is a fantastic read. And Tyrant looks at the plays of Shakespeare, and especially about the tyrants in Shakespeare, logically. And it has a lot to say about all of them, but especially about Macbeth. So are you there, Stephen? Hello.
I'm there, Anthony. Nice to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you for doing this and speaking to us. I want to first begin with the book itself. Why did you write Tyrant?
There was an immediate occasion and a long-range occasion. The immediate occasion was a turn of events in my own domestic American politics that I was thrown off by, unhappy about, wanted to think about, talked about at the dinner table nonstop, and thought, my God, this is related to this in Shakespeare and that in Shakespeare. So finally I did it. But the longer range issues have to do with thinking about how Shakespeare represented dangerous political subjects. The most dangerous in his time being, how does a country fall into the hands of a truly catastrophic leader? And you couldn't speak about this openly without risking losing your ears or your tongue or your head. And Shakespeare found, as did any of his contemporaries who wanted to address contemporary political issues, he found a way of doing this through art. And the ways he did it through art continue to be compelling after it is no longer dangerous to address political issues directly.
Stephen, and you managed to do this, I must say, in the book as well. It's very clear when you talk about the enablers, the people, the instigators, the people who think they're going to profit from the advancement of a person who's clearly incompetent. We understand our world better today, especially in a play like Macbeth, where the dead man's knell is scarce asked for whom, or they talk about mouth honor. Can you tell us a little bit about the plot of Macbeth, just what happens?
Yes. The plot of Macbeth is a story of a Scottish thane, general, basically, military figure in the rule of King Duncan, a ruler of medieval Scotland, understood, at least in this play, to be I think, an embattled but good leader. And this thane, this loyal general, has a weird experience, along with a friend, encounters weird women, strange women, and after a battle who greet him and greet him with the suggestion that he'll become King of Scotland.
And murder follows, and ambition. Now, Shakespeare seems to show us a transformation as well, because while Macbeth immediately thinks about the possibility of murder, he is also appalled by it. He finds it something that is very difficult to do. And as the play goes on, that changes. Can you tell us a little bit about his reluctance and how he overcomes that?
He has an absolute obligation, an obligation that he understands deeply as a ethical and social obligation to his political obligation to his ruler, Duncan. He doesn't see anything. We might see some limitations to Duncan, but he claims not to see any at all. He thinks of Duncan as a great ruler. And his first response is to be horrified at the very idea, but at the same time, obviously, clearly gripped by it, but without the desire to do it. And he does something that initiates in a profound way much of the action of the play, which is he writes a letter. He writes a letter describing what happened to his wife, who is not with him back in his castle. And that idea of writing the letter, and then Shakespeare has a stupendous scene in which his wife reads the letter out loud, receives it and reads it out loud, is in a way one of the most fascinating initiating elements in the play. It, among other things, even in Shakespeare's time, it would have seemed not impossible, but very unusual. Women were, a relatively small number of women were literate. A woman might have a letter read to her, as perhaps Shakespeare's own letters were read to Anne Hathaway, to Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. But in any case, this woman reads. And so she is one of the, however many percent, this is much argued, but let's say 5 to 10% of women who could read. She reads the letter and is immensely excited by the news. And that tension between her excitement and his horror mixed with some kind of deep response, is what launches the psychological drama of the first half of the play. I mean, and some of the greatest scenes that Shakespeare ever wrote, which I must say your production, which I watched, I had an opportunity to watch an advanced version of it, captures, I think, quite brilliantly the strange, powerful, the way the most powerful account of a sexual relationship between husband and wife in all of Shakespeare. The account of what's going on between them.
And in that letter, and it reminds me of management, saying, be careful when you raise expectations. But he does raise expectations about being a king, but he leaves out the little bit of information about Banquo being a line of kings, which turns out to be quite important later. How does Lady M manage to get her husband to commit a murder?
She's an utterly compelling figure, in some ways the most powerful and compelling figure in the play, as Giuseppe Verdi understood when he made this into an opera, and gives some of the greatest music he ever wrote to Lady M. Well, she is she's gripped by the idea enormously powerfully, excited by it. It's not 100% clear what it is that excites her. That is to say, she doesn't have a very full account of what it would be to be the queen. I mean, it's something in their relationship and in her whole vision of herself in relation to him that seems to trigger her desire to have this. But she's afraid that he has too much of the milk of human kindness in him, that there's something, he wants this, but he's soft a little bit. He may not pursue it. Or we would say he has moral compunctions, and she has to get him over those compunctions, and she does it effectively by a remarkable act of seduction, a seduction that involves sexual teasing or provoking or mocking. And again, in your production, one of the things that's very striking, as your viewers will see, is a very powerful representation of the sexual relationship between the two of them, of the excitement that passes between the two of them when they see each other after an interval.
It's a remarkable love story, and he doesn't show us married couples that are that kind of close, but here the union of two people, which should lead to slightly better decisions in life, leads to incredibly bad decisions. And you talked about the mocking, Stephen, in your book, you talk about how she uses the word man repeatedly, and the anxiety that comes when a person who becomes a tyrant has their masculinity, their potency questioned.
Yes, the desire to be a all-powerful ruler seems to be bound up with a certain kind of fantasy of masculine authority and power. Lady Macbeth simultaneously reinforces this fantasy, releases it really in its most toxic form, then you will be. Then you were a man when you talked about doing this. Now you're so much less a man, and so forth. By at the same time, she totally undermines it, because actually his manliness is constructed on the ground of her instigation, of something, of a woman driving him. And in fact, one of his strangest moments, I mean, there are many strange moments in the play, I mean, of strange gender roles. The most remarkable, when she herself wishes to be unsexed and filled with poison, with gall, to take her mother's milk out of her breasts and turn it into something bitter. But he imagining that he will rise up to this model of masculinity, tells her that she should have men children only, bear men children only, as if that were her destiny, to produce manliness, as it were, to produce men. It's a very, very strange and disturbed idea, and I think it never gets resolved in the play, or rather it gets deepened and deepened and deepened when he becomes more and more engaged with fantasies or reliance on the witches, when he becomes more engaged with a kind of mad project of trying to make himself, as he calls it, perfect meaning invulnerable.
At the beginning of the play, he talks about a single state of man that is shaken by the witches, and it feels like once that's shattered, he spends the rest of the play trying to get back to being that person at peace with himself. That was really interesting what you were talking about gender, because not only is there a question about what it is to be a man when Macduff says things like, but I must also feel it like a man. So the definition of what it is to be a man seems to evolve and have different ways of looking at it. But also the women, Hecate, which I've cut, but the three witches, Lady M, seem to really capture a good portion of the evil in the play. And so this idea of a nurturing female presence is kind of turned on its head.
I mean, the strange thing about, you're right, of course, but the strange thing about describing her as the locus of evil, or the witches for that matter as the locus of evil, is that it's not clear what they actually do. The beginning of the play, Lady Macbeth seems perfectly, eerily composed, cold, completely in control, worried only that her husband will lose control, will be inadequate for the deed. And then in the course of the play, she becomes more and more torn apart, until at the end of the play we see her sleepwalking, falling apart psychically, and finally committing suicide. He, on the other hand, begins the play completely torn apart. He can't decide what to do. And in the course of the play, he becomes icier, colder, more and more dead inside, so that they cross as a couple. And part of the, I won't say poignancy of the play, because this is a play in which there's so much horror that it's hard to describe it as poignant, is that this couple, basically, who think that they're going to unite over this act, actually come apart over this act.
Yeah, it's she is, despite the imploring him to do something evil, is ultimately quite innocent in a way, and spends the play gaining knowledge. Olivier famously said, and of course it sounds sexist, but it's of its time, that he knew everything and she knew nothing. So in other words, at the beginning of the play, he begins to suspect everything that's going to come their way, and eventually, I am settled. He locks in their fate. Having children and controlling the future is really kind of important to both of them. I mean, it leads to the killing of children, trying to kill Fleance. And both of them talk about, having a future in that way. In your book, you make this beautiful kind of point about tyrants killing children and, in a way, killing the future, because I guess they want to control it. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, First of all, one of the many mysteries of the play is it was a famous essay that meant to mock the very question, how many children had Lady Macbeth? How many children had Lady Macbeth? L.C. Knights, I think, is the author of this essay from, must be close to a century ago. And that's a way of, he meant this as a way of discouraging you from thinking about what kind of family life they had, because Lady Macbeth says, I have given suck. So she has had a child at some point. There's no evidence of the child any longer, or how many children there are, but it's quite important, I think, in terms of our understanding of them as a couple, that they have had a child between them, and they anticipate possibly having more children. I mean, hence Macbeth's bear men children only, and yet they destroy for themselves first of all, but for everyone else in their world, the future. It's only that Banquo's son escapes that enables the future to take place, but they would like to have killed him, as Macbeth arranges the killing of Macduff's children and wife. And I think that Shakespeare's vision, what's strange about it is, of course, I mean, we can ask ourselves how this ever happens. How does it happen with Hitler or Stalin or any of these monsters in our world? What do they think is going to happen? What do they think lies on the other side of their actions? And the play is deeply in touch with this from the beginning. What do you imagine is going to happen after you've done this and that and more and more and more? And Macbeth thinks, well, he'll be like marble or like the rock, he says, absolutely perfect, invulnerable. But it's never like that. You can't be perfectly invulnerable. It doesn't work that way. And what happens instead is that the world closes in on you. Something survives because the world goes on. But before then, you visit horror and destruction on your world. And just to say, Anthony, one of the things in Shakespeare's world, it's no longer for most of us a serious factor, but we have different way of thinking about it. But in Shakespeare's world, people thought about this issue often in theological terms. Has God determined from the beginning of time what's going to happen? Even to the evil and wicked man, if there's no freedom of the will, if you can't choose, what would it mean to live in a world in which you make horrible decisions, but you're not actually free to make them because it's already been determined? And that possibility haunts Shakespeare's play. We, I think of it now, if we think of it in these terms at all, we would think of it in terms of our genetic inheritance, where we have to do these things. We do destructive things because we're made that way. But Shakespeare has his own way of thinking about that. What does it mean for Macbeth knows? As you say, Olivier, I mean, I don't actually buy the Olivier account of Lady Macbeth, but I think it's a reasonable argument that Macbeth knows that he's heading into totally destructive territory, and yet he does it anyway.
And to your point about the witches do nothing, it's incredibly important they do nothing, because otherwise it's just a sad story of someone who was, destroyed by a group of witches. And instead, they have a catalytic function, which is they accelerate something that's already there. We would have discussions about why do the witches come and see Macbeth at this moment? And everything, all the clues they give him about the future are, of course, slight misrepresentations, and they are intended to encourage him and give him a confidence in the evil that's within him. So it is free choice, ultimately. It leads him where he is. It eventually breeds anxiety and paranoia. And you talk about that too in leaders who have become tyrants, that how that tortures them.
Well, you think, I haven't been in this position myself, not being a tyrant, but the idea in Shakespeare, and to some extent it seems to be borne out by our actual experience, is that people in this position think that they've managed to get it all in control. They have it locked up in a box. They're perfect, to use a word that I'm sorry to say our president uses all the time about himself. I'm perfect. That was a perfect conversation. I've responded perfectly to this, with that sense of everything is done, finished, boxed perfectly, but it never is. There's always something that escapes. And the fact that it escapes produces more and more anxiety to make it perfect. So that one of the terrible moments in the play, and strange moments in the play, is the moment at which Macbeth is planning to go ahead on his own without consulting his wife, in this case, for the killing of Banquo. And he says, "You'll applaud when you see it. I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing now, but you'll see it, and you'll think how," he calls her "dearest Chuck." At that point, he uses an affectionate nickname, which is also very unusual in Shakespeare. And you'll see how perfect I am. And it never works. It can't work. It can't work in the same way that all our ideas now, and this goes back to your question of, I'm not sure there is freedom of the will myself, but in any case, if we try to figure out how a genetic system works, it turns out even the greatest of our computer technologies can't go back far enough to actually make it all determined. It's never all determined. Something always escapes our determination. And that is deeply true in this play. And that's deeply true for our miserable tyrants, for the Hitlers and Stalins and the small versions of this that we have bustling about in our own world, who think that they can make everything perfect, but they never can.
So what you're saying is that given the imperfection of the world, given that things do go sideways, humility and patience, as well as in hard work, are ultimately what we have to do. The problem for the tyrant is that they want to make sure that everything goes in the direction they want for their own self. So narcissism seems to be playing a big part of this. You talk about that in your book.
I mean, Shakespeare, I think, first of all, really had a hatred of cruelty. He lived in a cruel world, a world in which there were spectacles of cruelty all the time, and I think he found it loathsome. And some, as you say, humility, some decency, some willingness to reach out to people who were less fortunate than you, some willingness to accept your position and not imagine that you're the biggest and most important thing in the entire world, some fundamental sense of being a human being with other human beings, recognizing with some empathy that there are other sensitivities in the world, other sensibilities. Think of those servants who sleep up with King Duncan, and the murder of them, they don't count for anything. There's no, Macbeth doesn't become hysterical with anxiety about their fate. It's just part of the general, for him, things you can step on, step over to achieve what you want. Shakespeare, I think, found that a particularly loathsome aspect of the bustling, tyrannical leaders of his world.
Stephen, we're at a time of pandemic. It's made us view things differently. In the period of time that he wrote this play and Coriolanus and King Lear, there was plague that kept on coming back and forth. And I've got a really hard, impossible question for you now. Because Macbeth is it has its own particular world within the canon. There's nothing that's quite like it in a way that you can't say about some of the history plays. It's got an individuality to it. Why did he write this dark, strange play that deals with the supernatural?
Three things. The first thing is, I don't know. No one knows. That's a sensible thing to say, but I'll say the less sensible things. First of all, in 1603 and 1604, there was a terrible epidemic of bubonic plague in England. It caused James I to delay his arrival, her triumphal arrival into the kingdom he has just inherited after the death of Elizabeth I. He didn't enter London to be crowned as he had anticipated doing. He waited because it was too dangerous to go into a crowded city. He stayed safely in some isolation. And the play is probably done in 1606 in the wake of a reopening of the theaters after this terrible plague. Because when the plague erupted in London, the theaters were closed because it had been recognized that large numbers of people brought together in closed spaces caused the increase in the epidemic. They didn't close the churches because they had the assumption that God would never let someone catch a fatal disease in the church while praying, but all other social spaces were limited or closed down. So that's part one. And part two is that in 1605, there was a terrorist, the most extraordinary terrorist attempt in the early modern world, an attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament and the king and his family, the famous gunpowder plot. Guy Fawkes. There's a complicated story, a long story, but that is the background. So of Macbeth is written in the wake of two terrible events, a epidemic disease and this attempt to destroy the government completely by terrorists. What's remarkable to my way of thinking is that Shakespeare, in his whole career, very, very rarely represents, in any sustained way, represents the plague, even though he lived in its shadow for his entire life. There was a terrible outbreak of plague in Stratford when he was born, 1564. It kept coming back routinely every few years. It took off gigantic numbers of people. I mean, numbers of people that are staggering in our current terms. A fifth of the population of Stratford upon Avon died in 1564, the year of his birth, and so forth. But though characters constantly invoke the plague, a plague upon these pickled herrings, or you're like a boil, a plague, a carbuncle, Lear says to his daughter, and so forth. A plague on both your houses, famously says Mercutio. But Shakespeare doesn't represent the plague, except one or two occasions in Romeo and Juliet. There's an interesting role of the plague in the plot. But Macbeth is an exception. Macbeth has a passage of description that comes closest, I think, in all of Shakespeare's work to an account of what it must have felt like to be in a population in the grip of a plague. And you've already actually invoked that speech at the very beginning when Ross says, in response to the question of Macduff, how fares it in Scotland? He says, "Alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself. It cannot be called our mother, but our grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is once seen to smile." You can smile only if you haven't been reading the newspapers, only if you haven't been watching the news, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are made, not marked, where violent sorrow seems a modern ecstasy, a commonplace, a trivial emotion. The dead man's knell is there scarce asked for who, as you quoted. And good men's lives expire before the flowers in their caps, dying or ere they sicken. Okay, that sounds like a description. As I say, it's the closest I think Shakespeare ever got to a description of what it must have felt like. But it's not about the plague at all. It's about what it means to have a murderous, incompetent, narcissistic, violent, unempathetic, sociopathic ruler. That's what it is to live in a political plague in Shakespeare's account. And I think part of the force of Macbeth is to channel what he and his contemporaries must have felt about an epidemic disease they could do nothing about, and to see its force in a political situation, in a family situation, in your relationships in what it means to try to survive as a society.
So in effect, he's given all of us a gift of a description of a place we don't want to go.
Yes.
And yet, from time to time, we find ourselves there. Stephen, I deeply appreciate your coming and speaking to us about the Scottish play. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you again about The Tempest. But thank you for this. Stay safe, and it's great to see you.
Thank you, Anthony. See you again soon.
Thank you,
Bye.
Stephen. Bye.